Hi, everyone. My name is Marcy Goldstein, and I am the Director of Academic Affairs at JILV. And I want to welcome you to this really important live stream event titled Post October 7th, Free Speech and Antisemitism on Campus. And we are joined by three wonderful panelists who I'm going to introduce, and then we're going to get straight into a discussion about this really vital issue. Dr. Lee is the director of the Coalition for Empowered Education. She is founding member of Free Black Thought and senior fellow for Do No Harm Medicine. She helps people better understand ideology and practice and the influences of race, gender, and other ideologies. Professor Stanley Dubinsky is a professor of linguistics and founding director of the Jewish Studies program at University of South Carolina. His research includes the syntactic and semantic analysis of a wide array of languages, intrastate ethno-linguistic conflict, language rights and policy, and most recently, linguistic analysis of biblical texts. Professor Rebecca Roiphe is Joseph Solomon Distinguished Professor of Law at New York Law School. She is a regular commentator on various news outlets on legal matters, teaches in the area of criminal law and ethics. She writes about the role of lawyers and legal institutions in preserving democracy. So let's set the stage for a moment. We're going to go through a few slides to see and show you what's been happening at universities nationally. This is an image that was shown at various universities. This one in particular was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. UC Davis professor makes the comment at the bottom there, this most important comment, that they can fear their bosses, but they should fear us more. This image was shown on the library at George Washington University. This Cornell history professor spoke in the middle of campus, talking about how the attack on Israeli civilians was exhilarating and energizing. This professor at UC Berkeley is offering students extra credit for participating in SJP's walkout against Israel. And this is a page from the National Students for Justice in Palestine Day of Resistance Toolkit, where they state explicitly at the bottom that we as Palestinian students in exile are part of this movement, not in solidarity with this movement. And this is a poll that was taken recently with just over 2,000 voters. And the question on the left says, do you think the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians in Israel can be justified by the grievances of Palestinians or is not justified? And what the results show is that increasingly younger voters, younger people, think that Hamas killing of civilians can be justified. And the other question says, do you think that the attacks on Jews were genocidal in nature or not genocidal? And the results again show that increasingly younger people think that the Hamas attack on Israeli civilians is not genocidal. So I hope that sets the stage for what's been going on in our country on campuses and in wider society in general. And we're going to pose some questions that our illustrious panelists are going to answer from their various, perspectives and expertises. So the first question is, how would you describe the situation nationally on your campus and or in your familiar educational environments? Professor Roiphe, would you like to start?
Sure. I think to varying different degrees, the campus, I teach at a law school, but I think universities as a general matter have become threatening places for Jews. I think this is, alarming, not only for the reason that these universities have historically been the place where Jews feel most comfortable and have thrived in the past as a community. And so, I think those are indicative of, certain places, and certain places are worse than other places. But to some degree, this is happening everywhere, and especially on college campuses. And so I think it's a hard time to be a Jewish student on these college campuses, especially one who's identified as Jewish.
Yeah. All right, Professor Dubinsky, you're in a different part of the country. What do you see?
Yeah, I would say, we've had much less of the kind of turmoil and the kind of threats on our campus than we've seen at Rutgers or at NYU or Columbia or any of these other places. And and I was led to think about it a little bit. And what it really comes down to in my mind is that the faculty are pretty much the same anywhere. They're all trained at the same institutions. They're guided by the same interdisciplinary rhetoric, especially in fields like literature, anthropology, sociology, and whatnot, and different ethnic and gender and different area studies. They come to the job with some of the worst inclinations to indoctrinate their students. And I think the difference is what is the disposition of the student body. On campuses where the students have come to campus with an inclination to agree with the faculty's predisposed positions, faculty are going to be more aggressive in pushing those positions forward and being, but like say on our campus, where students are less accepting of faculty's positions, faculty are much more cautious. And why is that? Because they care about course evaluations and they want to be more circumspect. That's probably more influential than the perspectives of any particular student, professor, or ed.
Okay, thank you for that. And Dr. Lee?
Yes. So from my perspective, which is a more national leaning perspective, these problems have existed, as the previous, folks just noted, for a long time on American campuses. There has been anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. All of those things have been existing prior to this. What the recent events of October 7th has done is to make it more visible to people. I've even had colleagues, who used to tell me, this really isn't, an issue on my campus, or I just don't see it here. We don't get a lot of complaints about anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism in my particular environment, in different pockets of California, New York, Pennsylvania, like all over nationally. I've had comments like that. But since October 7th, many of those same people have circled back to me and said, I'm actually seeing some things on my campus or in my community. And this isn't just at the college or university level. We're seeing this in K through 12. We're seeing it in all levels of American education. We're seeing students walk out, holding up pro-Hamas flags and slogans and placards. And it's been on the national news now. So even those who were denying that it was a concern or an issue, now they're faced with the objective reality of, what we see on numerous campuses at all levels of American education. And I really appreciate what Professor Dubinsky said. The problem is rooted in the training. And when we have situations where K through 12 and higher education faculty are receiving similar training, and also, this focus on DEI has made it even more so of a more universalized approach to teacher training. And it's one that is hostile to Jewish students, to Zionists, and to, any group that doesn't fit into their critical social justice narrative. So I think that that's something that maybe, the average person who wasn't in education field or something like that, they would have said, like, I've never heard of that stuff before, or I don't even know what that is. Now they're seeing it on their TV screens, and they're seeing it in their newspapers, and they're just seeing it in their communities. So that has been one of the things that has really brought this above board and into the consciousness of everyone. And anyone who's saying it's not an issue, or it doesn't exist, in our learning community, I find that a little suspect, and I would want to double click that and look into it a little deeper.
All right, wonderful. Did you want to respond? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Dr. Lee just said. there's the training has a lot to do with it, and in particular with respect to anti-Semitism on campus and anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. I mean, one of the problems that we face is the role of Jewish studies faculty. They have been notoriously insidious in helping to open the gates for the most vicious anti-Zionist students' opinions, because they go around and I'm not going to cast I'm not going to cast shade on every Jewish studies faculty, but I can say a loud minority, if not a majority, of Jewish studies faculty have taken up BDS as a position for themselves, have promoted BDS to their students, stand on the picket lines with SJP, and they go about presenting themselves with the "as a Jew" moniker. As a Jew, I support this. As a Jew, I support that. And what they do, and you have to contextualize this. Imagine if an African American studies faculty person here in the University of South Carolina were going to get on the side of keeping the Confederate flag on the state capitol, or making common cause with white heritage advocates. It would be condemned, and I know it would be condemned because I have colleagues in that role. So the fact that Jewish studies faculty make themselves out not to be allies of Jews is one of the hardest things to deal with, because this is the place where they should be at least showing support for their Jewish students, and not sending them down the wrong path, or sending them down a dangerous path, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just comment on that one from Professor Dubinsky? You know, he's really calling into our attention awareness about these ethnic studies programs in general, many of which are ideologically captured. They're captured by what I call a critical social justice ideology. And so the professors who are hired and work in those fields, like American studies, Jewish studies, African American studies, and so forth, the majority of them, I haven't seen one yet who's not using a critical social justice framework. I would love to meet some people who aren't using that type of framework, where you're focusing on intersectionality and these ideas of anti-Americanism. So it's American studies, but you're learning all the terrible things about America. For example, you're not really learning about the branches of government or civics or anything. You're learning about, why America is an imperialist power, and, the importance of decolonization and all of these other things. So these studies departments, they have names that you would think, oh, that's great. I would want my students or my child to learn, about American studies or Jewish studies. But what they're in fact learning is, and being steeped in, is the exact opposite of the naming convention on the majority of campuses. Again, I have not encountered a campus where that is not taking place. When you look at the syllabi, when you just take a look at the frameworks that are in use, we see time and time again these critical social justice ideologies, and they are anti-Jewish and they're anti-American, and it really does. The use of the fringe minority, right, of some of these activist organizations, like Jewish Voice for Peace and others. Many of the faculty align with those and are active members, and that's why they promote students participating in things like these rallies where we see, pro-Hamas rallies. These are faculty often giving extra credit, as one of the slides showed, encouraging their students to join in. And so I think that's something for us to all become aware of and to take a look at, and to note each time we encounter it, when we're hearing, this "not in my name" and all of these other slogans. It's very intentional, and we need to research who are these groups, and what do they actually stand for, and what are they promoting? Who's behind them? Who's really funding them? Where do their administrators live? I think for one of them, a Jewish Voice for Peace, it was shown a few years ago that their administrator was coming out of Lebanon. So, that's why we get these statements. And the environment that we have on American campuses is steeped in standpoint epistemology. So when someone stands up and says, "I am Jewish, and this is what we think," everyone defers without questioning that individual. So each person is supposed to represent a mass group, in the ideology of critical social justice. They have the sole authority to speak on it. And so when that one person speaks, who's a radicalized, non-mainstream perspective, they come to, quote, represent every person that falls under that banner, and everyone else is shunned into silence because their representative has spoken. And that's the kind of environment we have, not where there's even diversity of perspectives. Everyone knows, our different groups are not monolithic. We're diverse human beings, but the environment we've created is one where we defer to the authority who is the first to speak, and often these extremist activists are the first to speak.
I know we're moving in this direction later on as we have this conversation, but I just want to add that I think it's not just these departments, but rather a drift that the university has taken away from its central mission, which is the pursuit of knowledge, and toward a political mission. And that's, I teach at a law school. We don't have ethnic studies, but we still have the influence of this particular ideology because the entire endeavor has shifted away from learning law as a profession and as a practice toward a social justice mission. And as the school moves toward a social justice mission, and as Dr. Lee was saying, a particular group gets to define what that mission is, that's where this kind of insidious influence takes hold. And so that, what we have seen, again, I agree completely, this is just an explosion of something that existed before. But what was happening was the roots of what was happening had been planted long ago, which is we have moved away from knowledge as being truth, as being the thing that is supposed to be pursued in higher learning. Instead, a particular vision of the good life that has been so well described by both Professor Dubinsky and Dr. Lee.
Yeah, I've seen this crisis in education, viewpoint conformity. Professors are explicitly activists, sometimes I think even provocateurs, and it's definitely, pervasive. So maybe we can dive a little bit more. I think you've already addressed this really, but we often see mandatory DEI statements as part of university teaching job applications. So what are your further thoughts on that? What is the role of DEI in the current situation on campuses? Some say that DEI bureaucracy causes or perpetuates tensions. What more do you think about all that?
So this is a field that I work in, and I've worked in, for most of my educational career. And to see the way that DEI has infiltrated so many learning and civic organizations and spaces has been amazing to me because, usually in education, we say change moves slow. But in 2020, there was an acceleration of DEI initiatives throughout the nation, an unprecedented one, I would say. And as Professor Roiphe pointed out, it went from these fringe groups, so ethnic studies and gender studies, they used to be fringe disciplines on campuses, known radicals, known with different positions from the mainstream, but this took their perspectives mainstream and institutional. And so, we had these DEI committees form. Every school had to have a DEI policy, and now it's even a hiring requirement. So what was being done on the back end is now, again, visible for all of us to see. Of course, there was screening before, informal, and, there would be ideological litmus tests, if you will. But now we have those DEI statements as a written. Sometimes they have a video, and even your teaching demonstration has to include these principles in them, even to get hired on. So they're able to screen out who's not aligned with this critical social justice mission from the get-go. So that's why we have campuses that have literally been ideologically captured. We've screened out anyone with diverse viewpoint or that talks about multiple perspectives or, all the things that are a threat to the ideology or the revolution, that people are trying to enact in these learning spaces and have been succeeding with a lot of rapid pace and very efficiently. So I think that those are very problematic in my perspective. I think it's leading to campuses where people feel more disconnected and divided than ever, where there's a fear to speak, where, even as a professor who is supposed to have academic freedom and freedom of expression, all of those things are a threat because, if you say anything outside of the orthodoxy, tenured or not, your career could become at risk. And so it creates an environment that flies in the face of academic freedom for everyone.
And can somebody explain a little bit more about what that ideology is and why it's bad for Jews?
So I will. I'm sure others are maybe even better at doing it than I am. But I think part of there are two central problems in my mind. One is that essentially it creates a zero-sum game. So there is essentially a certain amount of success, of wealth, of good in the world, and that every bit that one party gets takes away from somebody else. And that the second part is that it defines the world in simple binaries. There are people who are oppressors and there are people who are oppressed. There are people who are colonizers and there are people who are colonized. In this worldview, it is very difficult to fit the Jews. And in fact, if you fit the Jews anywhere, they are in a very vulnerable position because in certain ways, Jewish people have a lot of power, particularly in Western society. They've gotten to points in many of them in their career where they are, or in their professional lives where they have, certain degrees of power in society, power in academia, power in Hollywood and politics. But that said, they also are in many ways extremely vulnerable. And if you take the situation in Israel, for instance, Israel is in some ways a very powerful country. It has a very strong military. It is a wealthy country that is successful on many levels. That said, it is a tiny little sliver of the only Jewish people in the middle of, I don't know what the exact number is, but 34 Arab countries. And so in that way is extremely vulnerable. And this simple binary does not take into account the complexity of power. And the complexity of power is so central to the Jewish position and to anti-Semitism itself, because the anti-Semitic viewpoint is always, it's never just we hate Jews because they're Jews. It's always under some guise of justification that they've gotten something or done something to get into positions of power that is illicit, and we need to strip them of that. And this is that view. As soon as we accept those binaries, as soon as we accept Jewish people as powerful people and nothing else, then we set up this justification for ripping that power by any means necessary. And that last part is really important and really illiberal. If we think about groups as sort of tribes and there's a zero-sum game, and when one tribe gets something, the other tribe loses it, and some tribes are justified and other tribes are bad, those are just not the values of a Western democracy. Those are the values that undermine Western democracy. So that's how I think the dynamic has been built.
Yeah. I would even start calling it anti-liberal. It's not just illiberal. It's like worse than that. It's anti-liberal. And we see that in the poll that I showed earlier, in that the younger, people are. They saw the attack on civilians in their homes, the butchering and the slaughter, as somehow justified. And it's increasingly, disturbing. And we see it as different in different age groups.
Right. And what Dr. Lee said before about the inability to see, as we criticize our own government and our own society, which is, of course, central to liberalism, the inability to see what is good about this society is also problematic. So you cast us as evil colonizers, devils, then you don't notice what's good about liberal values, how much freedom we preserve. I mean, it leads to this absurdity where you see like LGBTQ plus for Hamas. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, they would kill you. So where do you get that? Well, you get that is the weird, illogical, like Alice in Wonderland result of this particular ideology. Because what it does is it puts you in a group with other people and you don't even care who they are. As long as they're the people who are supposed to be on your side, that's it.
Right.
Yeah. I do think, when you've mentioned LGBTQ for Hamas, it's we joke about it being like chickens for KFC. There's a sense in here in which I think that the tribalism that you're alluding to, which is in some sense the makeup or the goal of DEI, which turns everything about the liberal foundations of our society on its head. It basically eradicates the idea of equality under equal justice or equality under the law. And that is the perversion of going back to tribalism. That's why you get situations where people look at people from the wrong tribe being murdered, and they say, well, they deserved it, right? Because we're not all equal under the law. Some people are deserving of punishment, some people are not. And what's sad about it is that we came out of, or we've been coming out of for generations, we've been coming out of inequality under law. We used to have a society where boys from private schools who stole a fishing boat got a stern warning, and boys from inner city who stole a car went to jail. And that was the inequality that we were trying to lift ourselves out of. And we made some progress in that regard, but now we're flipping it on its head, and we're saying that that only certain people have the right to speech, other people don't have the right to speech, and the tribes that were before held down now have it over those tribes who were above others. So I think that this whole idea of eradicating the equal justice provisions of our Constitution, and Dr. Goldstein, you said anti-liberal, not illiberal, is what we're dealing with.
I mean, Jews are fundamentally tribal. So it's not that there's anything wrong with there being tribes in the world. What's wrong with it is the idea that we build our political culture based on tribal prerogatives. That is illiberal. In the same way as we have a separation between church and state, the state views people as individuals. And if we start to view ourselves as these different groups that have certain rights, certain privileges, then we end up in this situation that I think is extremely problematic. So ironically, the best way to protect tribes is to have a political system that is not tribal, that is focused on the individual. In the same way as if you want to protect religions, you don't have religions in the state. You don't have established religions. You just let them thrive. And I'm all for the Jewish tribe and all of these other different groups of people succeeding and celebrating their cultures. The question is, how do we get there? And DEI is such a messed up way of getting there. And we're seeing the results of that right now.
Definitely. It's an unnuanced binary that does not take into account all the complexities of the world. There's many Israelis who are Black and brown, for instance. Historically, the Nazis killed Jews precisely because they were not white. So Jews are in this very tricky space that obviously is not going to be, we're not going to achieve true social harmony through a simplistic binary that does not take into account people's individuality. Dr. I think you're going to say something?
Yes, that's part of the problem with this toxic critical social justice ideology. It tries to simplify the human experience into race and gender checkboxes, and where do your checkboxes intersect, and which parts of your identity are oppressed, and who's more oppressed than the next person, and who's a victim, and who's the dominator in a situation. And there's a lot more complexity. So I appreciate what Dr. Goldstein had to say. One of the things, in my previous experience in working in DEI space, I was told that we don't focus on Jewish people or Jewish struggle because Jews are white oppressors. That's a strongly held belief in the critical social justice ideology, and it's a toxic and wrong one, and it's not rooted in any objective reality or history. When I would point out, well, what about the diaspora? The Jewish diaspora, the diversity of it. And I would just be told, that doesn't matter. That doesn't count. What about Mizrahi Jews? What about all the different types of Jewish people, throughout the world? And that's not something that's looked at. When you bring up the counterpoints that are rooted in, objective reality, those are tamped down, ignored. There's a willful ignorance and alignment of historical fact. When we get into talking about indigeneity, for example, there's just a willful want to distort things, to provide misinformation. And so that's why when we saw those stats that Dr. Goldstein put up before, I wasn't surprised to see that the younger people, who've come up through an educational system that has taught them misinformation and disinformation, would have such viewpoints. They hinge on slogans and in the moment, it's not rooted in any objective reality or historical fact. It's rooted in a narrative that's taught to them, and a toxic one at that. And we're seeing the reapings of it. And it concerns me such a great deal. I never thought I would see a day where we would see pro-Hamas rallies in the streets of America. And that's what we're seeing right now throughout the nation. And it's the fruits of the labor of these activists who have seized and captured so many aspects of our life.
Yeah, which is why we have a crisis of education. The disinformation is coming from the top down to the students. And getting back to something that Professor Roiphe said about Israel being a sliver of land in the Middle East. I remember I was teaching at UNC Charlotte about a decade ago, and I put up a map of the Middle East, and a student in the front, which was not included in the textbook, by the way, so I added it. And I have my thoughts about why it wasn't included. But I remember he leaned forward and he was like, "That's Israel? I thought it was a colonialist regime." No, actually, it's a speck in a sea of, I believe, 22 majority Muslim countries that have expanded, outward from the Middle East as well.
One of the problems, I think, Dr. Lee, you mentioned, the idea that racism is this. There is no objective race, and I as a linguist, I can tell you that you can't count languages, and I always challenge my students by asking them, how many races are there? Because what happens is that they can't answer that question because it's unanswerable. And the current perspectives on race is simply a resuscitation of 19th century racial science, which was debunked in the early 20th century. So I don't even understand how this thing got resuscitated, because it is so anti-science and so objectively wrong. And it just becomes just an epithet that gets thrown around without any grounding.
Mm. So one thing that you made me think of is who's funding all this, and we're going to do another live stream on the economics of DEI ideology. Moving forward a little bit, for now, I wanted to ask another question. How do we balance protecting free speech and protecting Jewish students? Are these objectives in tension with one another?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in and just say, I think that one thing we say in laws, we say hard cases make bad law. And I feel like this is a bad moment to have to be defining our First Amendment principles on campus. They have become so bad. And universities themselves have taken such strong statements on so many different issues that now when they don't take a side or don't make a statement when it comes to the mass murder, terrorist attacks, torture of individuals within Israel, that silence has a meaning. And so while in the abstract, I don't think the two things are inconsistent. I think the future and well-being of the Jewish community depends on protecting free speech. Absolutely. And I am a free speech almost absolutist, but I think now it's a very delicate and difficult problem right now, because I think that to hold on to those principles, which I hold dear and I think are essential for the Jewish community, is quite difficult right now because of what the university has become already. So that if we take this moment, for instance, to declare our neutrality principles, better late than never. But if you take this moment, then that neutrality principle looks a lot like taking sides and not taking the sides of the students who are being harassed right now. And so I think it can be done, but I just think it's a really difficult thing that requires a lot of careful analysis in each given instance in order to balance those two ideals and make sure that we protect our Jewish community and we also preserve First Amendment ideals going forward.
I think it is a question of taking sides. I think it's clearly a case of taking sides, because the university administration typically waffled between what are First Amendment rights and what we conceive of as campus codes of conduct. And on the one hand, the First Amendment rights are lauded, and when the university wants to get on the side of students who want to be outrageous and be provocative, and they tamp down on free speech and talk about hate speech and whatnot when they want to take the side of students who are feeling imposed upon. I mean, Stanford is a wonderful case of that. I mean, they had in the last year an elimination of harmful language initiative, where they were telling people not to use the word immigrant, not to use all kinds of. You weren't supposed to say American because the United States is only one country in the Americas. But at the same time that they had this elaborated and kind of ridiculous case of speech codes, in the last few days or so, in the last weeks or so, they had students marching around saying 2468, smash the Zionist settler state. And the university responded saying that they support academic freedom and the expression of controversial and even offensive views. So you have the university, Stanford University, supporting offensive views when they're lobbed against Jews, but protecting offensive views when anyone should dare use the word American to refer to U.S. citizens.
Yeah, I mean, 100% case in point. This is why preserving and holding on to free speech values protects Jewish people, because when you don't do that, it's just preferred speech, and the preferred speech is going to be the speech of the people who are anti-Semitic or, in fact, against any marginalized group. And so, to me, it is fundamental for all marginalized groups to protect the First Amendment. But again, it's a tricky moment to jump in and be doing it right now.
And I'm not much of a legal scholar, so I'll defer to Professor Roiphe if I say something wrong here. But to me, it seems like there's a line between freedom of expression and free speech and hate speech. And that's something that's being overlooked. Some of these slogans are direct calls for violence. And so is that okay, anywhere, even constitutional?
I mean, in my view, hate speech is protected speech. I mean, we have to protect the speech we hate. What isn't protected is harassment, threats, and intimidation. And I think that some of this speech has clearly crossed that line. If it crosses that line, it should not be protected. Those students should be seriously disciplined. There should be consequences for their action. Absolutely. But I mean, we've gotten ourselves so into this sort of safetyism where we've protected all of these groups from the tiniest microaggression that it seems ridiculous now that we were allowing this kind of speech to go forward. And so, if I could go back in time and I was president of any of these universities, I would have allowed that speech too. I would have made sure that, there were people who could say whatever they wanted to say, all lives matter, or whatever, kind of things that people found offensive. But we're in the world we're in. Hard cases make bad law. And so here we are in this very hard time where we want to do two things, which is protect our Jewish students and our Jewish community and preserve those fundamental freedoms. And it is heart-wrenching because it is so unfair that the same people who were making sure that certain students felt not the tiniest bit uncomfortable in class are now saying, sorry, you have to live with people saying from the river to the sea, or intifada, which clearly calls for the death of you and your people, and we're just going to allow that to happen. It's terrible. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think, long run, we have to reestablish these universities as what they once were, which is places in which the importance was put on the pursuit of knowledge, and that was the premium, and that's what mattered.
It's interesting what you just mentioned, Professor Roiphe. It sparked something in my mind, because I've been struggling with this question and wondering why so many of our presidents and senior leadership of so many colleges and universities are silent. Of course, they want to preserve the right to freedom of speech and so forth. But I kept thinking to myself, well, doesn't this not align with the values of the institution? And what we've seen is a corruption of the mission and vision of institutions. So now the activists can point to and say, no, we have a DEI policy. That is what we are all working under. And this policy says X and Y. So our institutions have literally, the North Star for them has been corrupted to this hellish vision of critical social justice in many cases. And so that's maybe what some of these presidents who are silent on the issue, because I kept just thinking to myself, why couldn't they say we support our students, right to freedom of expression, but this statement of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, does not align with our institutional values.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, right. And I mean, I think some of the statements may rise to the point. I mean, if something interferes with the ability of students to study at the schools, it could be seen as harassment, but usually that has to be directed at a particular individual. And so to me, these lines that we already have in First Amendment law are the lines that we have to respect. But again, the double standard is infuriating. I mean, just infuriating. And I don't know what to do with that anger, because you could, instead just try to capitalize on the situation and demand this treatment. But I don't think in the long run that's going to be helpful. I think, and I also think, Jews are tougher than that. Like, we can deal with that as long as you aren't hurting people, as long as you aren't threatening directly, as long, okay, like, go say your hateful things and we'll counter it with more speech. And I think that's kind of where we are.
But what I've been seeing in the news, though, Professor Roiphe, is Jewish students on campuses being locked in the library and not able to escape. I'm seeing the words becoming actions. I've seen Jewish students attacked physically when they come out to raise their flags for Israel and say, we support our people, and try to give a counter argument. I've seen them being physically attacked. So it's not just empty slogans and words
and those
calls to violence, but they're actually being followed by violence and other things.
Yeah, and I mean, and there should be and will be consequences. There will be consequences for those schools that are tolerating this kind of action, and there will be consequences for the individuals who are perpetrating it. Those are not protected speech, and the line is important. And once you cross over there into action, into actually interfering with a particular student's ability to move around or live on campus like that, there's no question.
This is a slippery slope.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is a slippery slope, and we've been sliding down the slippery slope for a long, long time. It has been, the idea of what is speech and what is not speech has been the issue. You're yelling through a bullhorn in front of someone's face, and people will say that, well, that's free speech, right? Or yelling through a bullhorn outside their home at night, and that's free speech because I'm speaking. And I think that the problem here is that the idea of what is speech gets confounded with what is harassment. So, I mean, one example that popped up in my head is that on Guantanamo Bay with terrorists who were imprisoned, they repeatedly played Metallica songs and other songs on repeat for hours and hours and hours as a form of torture. I don't think anyone would say that Metallica in that context was music. It was not music. It was torture. So, there are cases in which things that people call speech are not actually speech. They may use words, but they are not speech. And I think that applies to the heckler's veto. That applies to what Professor Roiphe talked about impeding people's movement through spaces. When Columbia University students, I think it was, set up barricades and checked people's identity, made a faux checkpoint on the campus for Jewish students. All these kinds of things are not speech, and defacing property with words is words, but it's not speech, right?
I also think of images, the paraglider image that was circulated. I mean, those were the Hamas terrorists landing in Israel to slaughter civilians in their homes. And I believe that the Senate just unanimously passed a resolution condemning Hamas and anti-Semitic student activities on college campuses in the US. So that's going to enter into the picture of how we adjudicate between free speech and protecting students, which leads me to another question. When is legal action an appropriate measure?
Well, I mean, I think we answered that question. I mean, at least for me, it's like, to me, it's there may be slippery slopes all over there, but there's an actually pretty clear legal line. And when that line is crossed, there should be people poised to bring lawsuits, to bring criminal cases, to bring civil cases, to bring Title VI cases against these universities. That's how I think it should be handled, because we've gotten to a place where it's confusing. The reason why it's confusing is because these university administrators have completely remade this line. They've made it so that the idea is when you go to school, you're safe from uncomfortable ideas. And that is not, I mean, speech can be really, as you said, the paraglider, I mean, just heartbreakingly awful. And we are not protected from that. We are protected from threats, from, from all of those things, and they exist right now. So we should go after them, right? And make sure that we are policing that line as well as we can. And I think we should also, I don't know whether legal, also sometimes you just need to go advocate with the university and make it clear to the university that they need to start addressing these problems on their own, even before we get to legal action.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that it's not that hard. It occurs to me that any offensive action that would be sanctioned under ordinary circumstances shouldn't be allowed or shouldn't be excused just because you're using that same offense to express your opinion. So if you would stand outside my house shouting at my house with a bullhorn, just because you wanted to, I would call the police and they would arrest you for disorderly conduct. And the fact that you're shouting outside my house and calling me a Zionist Jew doesn't excuse it any more than it would excuse it if you were like yelling at my dog. So I think that these offenses have to be judged in the absence of speech. In other words, would this behavior be tolerated if it wasn't about speech? And if it is about speech, it still isn't tolerated. That's where I would leave it.
Yeah, the double standards are pervasive. Do we allow students to call for the destruction of a country?
And in many of these environments, Dr. Goldstein, students are afraid now to even say, I'm a Jewish student, or I identify as a Zionist, or, I'm an ally of the Jewish people. Like when we have that kind of environment on campuses where you cannot be your quote most authentic self, which was supposed to be the whole goal of DEI as they openly stated it. It's not the outcome that we're seeing for sure. And so I think it comes back to I'm really proud of the students who are in the trenches, who are at their universities and colleges and calling on their administrators and saying, we don't feel safe. I thought this was a safe space and a quote brave space for everyone. What is this institution going to do for us? I encourage the students to continue to join together. You're not alone. You have many allies, and to continue to speak up and to push back against this. Don't let them cower you into fear or hiding. That's an outcome I definitely don't want to see. At some of the universities and colleges where I've previously worked, we no longer have a Jewish student union, for example. We don't even have, we have all these groups for these racialized affinity groups under DEI, but it's noticeably absent on some campuses because they've literally created such a hostile environment that, of course, Jewish students are there, but they're not identifying because they don't want to be attacked. And so I think that that's something to take a look at, and just the greater support we can send to our students who are there and who have brave faculty members who are willing to, stand as advisors for them and to, call upon their administrations to make it a more inclusive environment. I think that's so key. And so I just stand in awe of the students who continue to come out and counter protests and the great risks they face just for simply existing on campus.
One thing else I'd add is just because it's protected speech doesn't mean we need to just throw up our hands and say, okay, forget it. We just have to let them go ahead and do this. There are all sorts of ways short of disciplining them, expelling them, punishing them to deal with speech that's hateful. I mean, to say something like, from the river to the sea, which is calling for the destruction of the Jewish state and all the Jewish people, where are you going to move them? So the Jewish people too, that may not rise to the level of the kind of speech that we can punish. But that's not the kind of speech that we should engage in an educational institution in which we're promoting the search for knowledge. So there are ways, schools have ombudsmen, schools have, all sorts of ways to counter speech with more speech, not in a screaming match in a protest, but rather bring the people who are responsible for making those signs, sit them down and talk to them. Like, what do you think you're doing to your fellow students? How do you think you're making them feel? And how do you think that they can thrive educationally in an environment in which you're doing that? If you feel like there are problems with what Israel has done and what it should do, is that can we think of a more productive way to engage in this conversation in a way that furthers our mission rather than impedes it? And I think that should be done when we run up to that limit that the First Amendment establishes.
Yeah,
I really love that, Professor Roiphe. Unfortunately, many of our schools have hired DEI chancellors and officers and so forth. None of those people at many places are doing exactly what they should be doing, right, to increase inclusion and belonging for Jewish students at this critical moment. They're not doing it. So I hope there's more accountability from the funders and the local faculty, and students to say, what does this DEI office do? What is this chancellor doing? Are they creating opportunities for us to increase understanding and dialogue together? We're not seeing it.
yeah.
I mean, it just reflects so poorly on the DEI structure that these schools have been forced to create separate anti-Semitism task force. Like, what is diversity and inclusion if it doesn't include this? I mean, they should be looking at this infrastructure that they've created in the school. It's completely illegitimate if it can't take care of a problem like this.
Well, to shine a possibly positive light on the structure. At the University of South Carolina, we actually have managed to make inroads in the DEI sphere. We established on our campus a Jewish Faculty Staff Council, which was established on the same basis with the same structure as the African American Faculty Staff Council, which had been around for a much longer time. And we have our representative, the convener of our council, has a seat at the DEI board, has the ear of the VP for DEI, which is now retitled to something else based on a court decision, but whatever. And we actually have their ear. And so we have been able to make, some good progress and to address what Professor Roiphe just said about the leadership. You cannot expect the administration to violate the Constitution and shut down free speech on a campus. But they can exert leadership, and that's exactly what's missing in most of these cases. I'm an alumnus of Cornell University, and increasingly day by day more ashamed of my university. But the fact is that the current president could have shown more leadership at any step of the way leading up to the most recent very, very public threats to Jewish student safety and lives that broke out in the last week or so. I mean, in one of her messages, which I thought was telling, she had an appeal for people to learn about the history and politics of the Middle East, and I thought that was great. But it would be laughable because it was like gaslighting everyone around her. Because when Professor Russell Rickford announced that he was exhilarated, this is a history professor at Cornell, announced he was exhilarated by the massacre of 1,400 Jews. It would have been appropriate for President Pollock to say to him publicly, you should learn about the history and politics of the Middle East, because obviously Professor Rickford doesn't know anything about the politics of the Middle East if he's exhilarated by the massacre of 1,400 innocent civilians. And for the university president to instruct everyone else around her but Professor Rickford to learn about the politics and history of the Middle East is just gaslighting, if anything.
And if we're talking about how these student organizations are making other students feel, what about addressing the professors? How do you think it feels to a Jewish student sitting in class, hearing that you thought the attack on Jewish civilians, Israelis, was awesome, which I believe was the descriptor used by a professor at Columbia University? So moving ahead a little bit more, going back to one of the slides, if anybody wants to revisit it, the National Students for Justice in Palestine Toolkit wrote a statement, and it says the following: we as Palestinian students in exile are part of this movement, not in solidarity with it. And so we have pro-terrorist activity on campus. And I believe that this is one of the lines that Governor DeSantis used to remove SJP from universities in Florida. I'm wondering if what you think about this way of using the law to help shift, speech and activity on campuses.
I personally am not very well disposed towards shutting down student groups, or even if it's SJP. And I'll say why. Because when you shut down a group like SJP, the way DeSantis is proposed to do, you're making them into a victim. It's much more effective for leaders to be leaders and to stand up and say, we protect SJP's right to say all the horrible things they want to say, but we as leaders think what they're saying is disgusting, and we want everyone to know that we think it's disgusting. I mean, it's far more effective to shame a group like SJP and let them say as loudly as they want, whatever they want, but call them to task for what they say, than it is to shut them up. Because in the next moment, they're going to say, we've been victimized by the administration. We've been victimized by the oppressor class.
I mean, I am sort of a First Amendment absolutist. So I actually don't think that we should have university administrators stating an official point of view. Again, this is a bad time to be reimposing the rules that I think should have always been on college campuses, because they haven't been for the past at least decade, but certainly probably more. And so doing it now seems so unfair to the Jewish students who are experiencing this at this moment. But I don't think it is the university. I think the university should, as a general matter, adopt neutrality principles. And that is the only way to return the university to something that was at one time a comfortable home for Jewish students. And I also think shutting down SJP because they said something like that is just going to end up, first of all, not being effective, and second of all, is stretching what they meant by. I mean, they don't mean like we're now going to commit terrorist acts. I mean, if they did say that more explicitly, then like, okay, for sure. But it's rhetoric, and I don't think that. I mean, material support for terrorism requires more than just saying I'm with the terrorists, and so I think it's hateful, hideous, horrible. And I think the way to combat it is through education and more speech. And as frustrating as that is right now, because the university has been such an ally to every other group that has been even remotely insulted, even, that it seems ridiculous that it wouldn't be now to the Jewish students who are actually under significant strain and threat. I don't actually think that that's what how the university should respond.
I think also we need to discern between whether we're speaking of a public university or a private university when making these decisions, right? Because public universities should be held accountable to the public. And when you teach in a public university, you take an oath, to my knowledge, to protect and uphold the U.S. Constitution. And when you have student groups that are literally aligned with federally recognized terrorist groups and promoting their agenda and options on a public university, I think that becomes problematic, and that's something to look into, because that's public funds. So we're going to spend American public funds and taxpayer dollars to support student groups that are aligning themselves with and promoting perspectives of known terrorist groups and organizations, federally recognized terrorist groups and organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of the others. And so we have a duty to see where our funds are being spent. And that's why I think that some of the legislation around this, as it affects, public universities, it needs to be much more vigilant, and people need to look into it much more. And I think some of the states are doing that. I think it's wrong for public taxpayer dollars to fund terrorist organizations, even if it's a student group. It's something, think back to when we had the Weather Underground, on campus, and AIRS and the work that was being done through that organization, a terrorist organization we have chapters in all of our schools. It's okay to have that. No, absolutely not. So what is making this situation different? Why is this a different situation where we're saying it's okay, to allow these domestic terrorists to launch their activities from our public universities and colleges? It wasn't okay in the past. I don't see how it's okay right now, beyond the explanation that we're just literally seeing anti-Semitism in action, and the okaying of it is a dangerous one. These are groups that call for the destruction, not just of Israel, but of Western society. And America is part of Western society. So they're calling for our own destruction, and making movements to do that and supporting actions that do that. So to me, that's crossing a line. And I'm glad to see some states that are taking action against that. I don't think it's okay for terrorism to be promoted on the public dime in any place.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I just would be very careful about defining terrorism. I mean, in exactly the same way as, a lot of student groups got caught up in the sort of anti-communist madness, and we're not really, terrorist organizations advocating the overthrow of the American government. They were simply cheering along, in a distasteful way sometimes, the activities of those groups. And so I think we need to make a firm distinction between those who are actually advocating, and using those sorts of tactics, and those who are cheering along in a disgusting and hateful way. And the statement that I heard you read, Dr. Goldstein, to me didn't make it clear that these groups are actually terrorists. But if they're terrorist cells, get rid of them at any university. I don't have any problem.
Right. So we'll further explore it during our next live stream when we look into the economics behind the scenes. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here today. It's been such an incredibly rich conversation. I hope that everybody shares this recording when it's posted with lots of people. We've seen lots of comments come in from the side that I'm not sure we necessarily have time to deal with, maybe a few for 5 minutes or so. One person said, do you see geographical differences in anti-Semitism at universities? And my personal answer to that is yes, that it's worse, like on the coasts, really, the New York area, Columbia University, Cornell, NYU, Penn, and then the UC system is like an extreme example of something quite problematic, which is a public institution, obviously, which is kind of different than what's going on the East Coast and some of the Ivies, which I think some people anyway are now starting to call the poison Ivy League, which is a catchy way to kind of out the problem. Does anybody else want to talk about geographical differences?
I think I could talk about the Southeast a little bit, because that's where I am.
Yeah.
I think that the Southeast, South Carolina, maybe not so much the metro areas, certainly not Chapel Hill area, which is a little bit more northern facing than it used to be. But a lot of the Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and northern Florida, for example, tend to be more conservative. And as I think I said at the very beginning, the disposition of the students has a lot to do with what happens on campus. When students come onto campus and they are, let's say, less liberal, less progressive in general, I think faculty, even if they come trained from Princeton and Rutgers and Stanford and whatnot, even if they come to our campus that way, they're a little bit more cautious in revealing their, let's say, radical positions to their students, because they don't want to be, they don't want to have bad course evaluations. I mean, people come onto campus, they have to undergo tenure and promotion procedures, and bad course evaluations can harm that. So people are looking after their own situation primarily.
Speaking of which, somebody put a comment that her son may need to now worry about being Jewish on campus, and he's looking at how to pass as a non-Jew on campus. And I think that's really pervasive. There's a lot of conversation about this in some new Facebook groups. One is Mothers Against College Anti-Semitism, which has really taken off 45,000 people and a few hundred lawyers, I think. And there's a lot of conversation that certain people are privy to. There's non-Jews in that group as well, I've seen. And I think that in order to gain, sympathy for people in other groups, that this kind of fear that people are holding needs to be shared with people across, different tribes and with different identities. I would also say that in my role as Director of Academic Affairs, I've gotten many, many emails from professors saying, I'm isolated on my campus, I'm scared. I see these aggressive statements chalked on the sidewalk at my university, and it's terrifying. I'm scared to even say something because then I might be attacked. And so this is happening to people at all different levels, and the self-censorship is real. And this is just such a hot flash moment, obviously, to try to make things better. So I want to thank everybody again. It was just a great collection of experts here, and I appreciated hearing everything that you were saying. And I would just say to be continued, and to everybody who's listening to please be in touch. I think with any of us, my email address is marcy@jilv.org, and I would invite any further conversation from anybody so that we can hopefully achieve social harmony for the greater good. Thank you so much, everybody.